Welcome to the Debrief, Carolina Journal's weekly recap of major developments in North Carolina politics and public policy. Plenty of interesting things to talk about this week. My name is Mitch Koch. I am sitting in for Donna King, and I'm joined by a star-studded cast of panelists once again. We have a couple of the reporters from Carolina Journal. Alex Baltziger is the political reporter who's focused on the General Assembly. And we have David Bass, who focuses a lot of his attention on education issues for Carolina Journal. And on the other orange couch, a couple of other interesting experts who will provide a lot of great analysis for us. Dallas Woodhouse, in addition to being the woodshed commentator for Carolina Journal, his daytime paying job is North Carolina State Director for American Majority. And we're joined for the first time by Dr. Andy Jackson. He directs the Civitas Center for Public Integrity at the John Locke Foundation. Welcome to all the panelists. The big news for much of the week in North Carolina politics and policy was on the issue of redistricting, once again drawing North Carolina's election maps. Now, last week we showed you the newly redrawn maps for North Carolina's 14-member congressional delegation, plus all of the seats in the State House and the State Senate. Lawmakers ended up adopting those maps this week with just some minor amendments. The votes were finalized on Wednesday. Now, Governor Roy Cooper has no role in this redistricting process. He cannot use his veto stamp, so the new maps became law once legislators approved them. Now, on this week's program, we're going to talk about the potential impact of those maps. And this week is a great one for introducing our new panelist, Dr. Andy Jackson. We mentioned he directs the Civitas Center for Public Integrity, and he spends a lot of his time looking at maps like these. So Andy, welcome to the show. And as you were watching this process play out, what did you think about this latest round of redistricting?
Well, it went about what we would expect. The courts basically went back to the criteria that we had had since basically the dawn of our little republic here in North Carolina that said you could use partisan factors when you're drawing districts. There was this brief couple of year period when the court said you could not. We've gone back to doing that, and that's what the General Assembly did. They used a lot of other traditional factors and also like trying to keep your municipalities whole. Weren't so great on compactness on some of these, but on a lot of these measures, these maps are actually better than a lot of the maps passed by the General Assembly in previous decades. So in that sense, they are adhering to those criteria better than they had been. They could be a little better, but they were also bringing politics back into it, which is what the court said they could do.
Yeah, certainly if anyone looks at maps that were passed in the 1990s, back when the Democrats were in charge, you had tendrils that looked like an octopus somewhere. You had that 12th district, the snake that went all the way down I-85.
There ain't never been a map ever drawn by anybody anywhere that didn't have politics in it. It's just depending on whose politics it was.
Yeah.
Right.
Andy, tell us a little bit about how these maps stack up in terms of which party is likely to benefit as they move forward.
Well, very briefly on the congressional side, you're looking at a 10-4 map, and one of those Democratic-leaning districts is actually really, really close, Don Davis's district. It's in the northeastern part of the state. It's been trending Republican, so we're expecting that one to get increasingly competitive, and maybe by the end of the decade it might be a lean Republican seat.
Let's take a look at that congressional map as you're talking about it. So how about some of the other districts? What are some of the highlights?
I think a couple of the other real highlights there is that we have the 12th district in Charlotte. We're largely keeping Charlotte whole, which is a problem that we had with the court-ordered maps where they basically took a meat cleaver, cut the city in half. So that is a definite improvement. One thing that the General Assembly has is a bit of a strange obsession with making sure that Greensboro is represented by Virginia Fox, who is up in Watauga County. So once again, they have her district coming down in there. That is a little unfortunate. There are some other districts that may look a little weird, but actually make some sense. And I'm really thinking about the 13th, which is this district that starts down in Lee County, wraps around Wake, and then gets up to Virginia line. That looks, if you're at first brush, it looks horrible. But you realize there's actually a community of interest argument for that map. That is an outer suburb triangle district. These are folks that have a economic connection to the triangle, particularly Raleigh. These are a lot of people, and if you don't believe it, I know I have relatives who do this. People that commute from Sanford, commute from these places almost up in Virginia down to the triangle to do their work. So there is that connection, but they still have that same lifestyle. They still choose to live away from those larger cities, and that is almost a perfect district to represent those interests.
How about in the legislature? We know that we've got 50 state Senate seats, 120 state House seats. Right now, Republicans have super majorities. How do things stack up for them in these new maps?
In these new maps is looking fairly similar, a slight improvement for Republicans, but it's certainly not an overwhelming Republican map in the sense like they're guaranteed a supermajority every time. They're going to have to earn it in elections. Right now, if Republicans want a supermajority, they're going to have to win all the Republican-leaning seats and pick up some of those toss-up seats.
Let's go ahead and pull up, because we have some graphics that you and your colleague Jim Sterling put together. First of all, let's look at the state Senate, your CPI index. You basically have the ones that are most likely to be won by either party, and then the leans and the toss-ups. Where does that stand?
Well, right there we see we've got 28 that lean to various amounts towards Republicans. And I will say, safe districts are just what they sound like. It would take like a major scandal for a Republican to lose one of those, and same thing for their Democratic counterparts. The likelies, once again, probably going to go that way. Once in a blue moon, I think the Democrats lost a likely seat in 2022, but there was a spousal abuse scandal that led to that, at least partially. But those lean districts are districts that really, if the other party has a good year, they can pick up. Like Democrats picked up some lean Republican districts in 2018. Republicans picked up some lean Democratic districts in 2020. So those are actually kind of in the mix for competitive districts. And so it's possible, if Democrats have a good year, they can get a majority in the General Assembly, but they have to have a good year for that, and they haven't really had a good year in quite a while.
And if we could put that same graphic back up again, the interesting thing is, for those who haven't followed it, you need 26 seats to have a majority. So the Republicans there would have to pick up all their safe seats, all their likely seats, and at least some of the lean seats to get a majority. They would need to get all of those, and then a couple of the toss-ups to get to a supermajority. So when people say, oh, they're creating a supermajority even more than what they have now, that's not what your data seems to suggest.
No, certainly a supermajority is not baked in. They're still going to have to earn it at the ballot box and convince voters, especially in some of these suburban areas that tend to be a little closer, that they deserve their vote. And so they're going to have to get out there and campaign.
If we can put the graphic back up for one second, I do think there's one important thing you need to understand here, is these numbers are not, if you look at the number of Republican safe and likely seats, that number is virtually no different than what the court-drawn map was last time. The changes to this map gave the Republicans a chance to be a little more competitive in a few other seats, but this map is not really substantially different than what the court imposed on Republicans 2 years ago.
Which we aren't really hearing in the debate, especially from the other side. Let's flip to the House now, and let's put up the graphic on the CPI ready for the House. And Andy, tell us what we've got going there.
Well, we've got a similar story going here, in that you've got your set of safe Democratic and safe Republican seats going on, but the Republicans don't have a supermajority locked in. The Democrats will still have to kind of claw into the Republican-leaning seats in order to get themselves a majority. But it's certainly not cut and dry. You certainly are going to have elections, and both parties are certainly going to have to go out there and earn the voters' trust on all these issues. Another thing we want to remember is that these numbers are not set in stone. Right. There is going to be shifting. There's demographic shifts over time. There are political shifts over time. And so a lot of these districts, particularly those lean districts, could end up becoming more or less competitive as voters change their ways. And so if we were doing this, again, assuming that these maps hold up, and we were doing this similar analysis for the 2030 election, we could see very different results.
I think there were 69, according to the Civitas ratings, there were 69 in the lean, safe, likely Republican category. There were 3 toss-ups, and then there were 48 in the lean, likely, safe Democratic category.
Yeah, let's
So
pull up that
Republicans
graphic, 'cause
would
we
need
have
to
it.
win all three of those toss-ups
Right.
in order to get to the 72 threshold, which is the supermajority.
So yeah, Republicans can't just hold up in a fortress in some of these rural or outer suburban districts. If they want to win, they're really going to have to get out and compete.
It isn't baked into the cake for supermajorities, but it's going to be very interesting to see what happens. Let's shift gears a little bit now. Great analysis from Andy. Dallas, you've been following North Carolina politics for years and years.
Yep.
As you watch this redistricting debate, what stood out to you?
Well, there are a couple things, and I think you have to separate the congressional maps from the legislative maps. There are different rules. The congressional maps, Republicans obviously took the opportunity to draw Republican districts, as legislatures do and have done. I don't think you can look at many of these districts and go they are overly gerrymandered. I look at the 1st Congressional District. The 1st Congressional District, where Don Davis was a Biden +5 district. It had lost population. Republicans had to put more voters in there.
Let's go ahead and pull that map up, by the way. This is the congressional
That's
map.
right.
And the district that Dallas is talking about.
And it's in, when the map comes up, it's in purple. And so the Republicans went to the far, as I'm looking at the map, to the far right, to what we call the finger counties in Currituck County, and they added those voters in. They had to add population. That district is shrinking. It is all whole counties except for one part of Granville County. Now, that district turned out to be a little less favorable to the Democrats. Now, there's going to be a lawsuit over that. I suspect the Democrats in court will contend that the Republicans had a responsibility to go in to Pitt County or somewhere and find black voters to put in that district. I think it's a hard argument. So I think, to the winner goes the spoils in our system, and, the congressional districts are a significant partisan advantage for Republicans in North Carolina. I think that generally speaking, Democrats have overemphasized the impact and the difference that partisan consideration make in the legislative maps. Let's be clear. In 2022, when Ted Budd ran for Senate, he only won the state by 3.6%, okay? But he won 80 of North Carolina's 100 counties. In our system in North Carolina, we emphasize, the state constitution requires that we honor county lines. There is no map that any human being can possibly draw in North Carolina right now that would put Democrats in legislative majorities if they are losing 80 out of 100 of North Carolina's counties. Now, land doesn't vote, people do. But the fact is they are highly concentrated, they are highly contained, and for them to get into a majority position, once again, they're going to have to change their political coalitions. They're going to have to get more voters in different parts of the state of North Carolina. And I think what I've seen over the last decade is I wouldn't like the situation that Democrats are in if I was a Democrat. I would feel like we ought to do a little better. We do a little better in statewide races. We ought to win more seats. But I also think the gerrymandering argument has prevented them from taking a deep look inside and going, what can we do differently to try to attract voters back and win seats that we used to have in Davidson County, in Davie County, in Scotland County. Places we used to win where the districts aren't all that different.
Where the rules, where you don't like the rules, you still have to abide by
That's
them.
right.
And Alex, I wanted to turn over to the other couch because you guys, we've been kind of having you sit silent there for a while. But what are some of the main things you've been focusing on with this?
Well, to Dallas's point, when you're talking about coalitions, you look at the safe Democratic seats, and they're often like 80-20 Democrat, and that is because the Democrats just have such condensed coalitions of people in these urban areas. But you look at the safe Republican seats, and they're often like 60-40, 65-35, something more like that. And so when you do the math there, obviously the Republicans are able to spread themselves out a lot more due to Stevenson and our county criteria. But yeah, with regard to the state maps, these are obviously Republican favored. The Republicans got to control the lines, and so they're going to be able to, they have a little bit of wiggle room still within the Stevenson criteria to do some things that they would prefer, but they do hold the pen, as was referenced many times during these discussions, and I think it definitely worked to their advantage.
I mean, in essence, Democrats continue to argue for some kind of proportional representation standard, that if they win X amount of a statewide vote, then they should result in X amount of seats, which is not our system. And I think, I also want to talk a little bit about competitiveness, because there's a lot of talk about competitiveness. These districts aren't competitive, the maps aren't drawn to be competitive, and people mix up two things, okay? If you look at the congressional map, right, we went from a map drawn by the courts that was 7-7. Only one of those districts was really competitive. Now, if you look at the new Republican map, which is probably a 10-4 map for Republicans, it might be an 11-3 map, but the average race in that map should be more competitive. Republicans may still win it, but instead of, instead of having a 40-point win or a 30-point win, some of these are going to be 15-point wins and 10-point wins. They are actually more competitive districts. That is somewhat true in the legislative maps, that there are actually more competitive races that are still likely to go the Republicans' way, because sometimes I think what the other side does is they mix up competitiveness in the sense of overall numbers of how the maps lay out rather than competitiveness in the individual district, which is actually what's important to the voter.
Yeah, very much so. Now, one thing we want to point out is that these maps have already prompted some candidates to decide, hey, I'm not going to run for the seat I have, I'm going to run for something else. And there is a very major development on that front that David Bass, you wrote about, and that is our one of our newest members of Congress, Jeff Jackson. His new district would not be friendly to him, so he's not going to run for Congress again. He's going to run for state attorney general. Tell us about that.
Right. I think this was the not a secret that he was going to jump into this race clearly after the maps came out. This was the kind of day where it's great to cover North Carolina politics. It was fun. He put out this, he's the TikTok guy. Everyone kind of knows him as that. He put out this TikTok video.
And let's watch the video.
Yeah, absolutely.
Got some news for you. A group of politicians in North Carolina just redrew my congressional district to take me out. They're going to replace me with one of their political allies. That's political corruption, and I've got news for them. I'm running for attorney general, and I'm going to use that job to go after political corruption. It's going to be a fight. There are people who mean you harm. The job is about standing between you and them, which means I'm going to take some hits.
All right, so Jeff Jackson remaining on brand with a TikTok video. You had some fun with that, covering it.
Yeah, I mean, that's the kind of thing that, of course, his supporters, the Democrat base, kind of lapped it up. They love that. I think it was a target-rich environment for kind of making fun of some of the boxing kind of element. It was kind of, I think some of the comments, it was kind of weirdly placed together in some areas. It was just a little bit odd. You could kind of make fun of that.
A Democrat promoting such a violent sport. I mean, I don't know about all that now.
Toxic masculinity right there with Jeff Jackson. So, but it is interesting in that, so he's now in the Democrat race for the nomination, could potentially go up against Dan Bishop on the Republican side if he wins. That would be a very interesting race for AG. There hasn't really been a Republican in 150 years, 140 years actually elected as North Carolina Attorney General. So for a Republican to win there would be a huge deal. I think Democrats are excited to have Jackson there. It'll be interesting to see what he does next on TikTok.
And Dan Bishop, another former member, or a current member of Congress, will soon to be former, who's going to run for the seat. And Dallas, he's welcomed Jeff Jackson into the race.
Yeah, they messed around today, and his consultants put out stuff talking about him welcoming in the Chinese TikTok star. That's going to be, a fascinating race. And we've already seen some other things. We anticipate current House Speaker Tim Moore getting into what is the new district in Jeff Jackson's area, which has part of the western part of Mecklenburg County, but goes up to Moore's home of Cleveland and Gaston counties. Mark Walker, which we reported exclusively at Carolina Journal, dropped out of the governor's race and will try to return to Congress in the 6th congressional district, which has a good part of Guilford. It has Rowan. I think it has Davie and Davidson, but I know it has Rowan. So some high-profile people in that. Erin Paré, we expect to be at least one high-profile candidate. She's a member of the State House in the, I guess, the 13th, which has part of Wake County, but it is the one that Andy referred to earlier in the segment about some of the exurbs of Wake County, including Lee and Harnett, Johnston, on up to maybe part of Franklin.
Franklin, Granville.
And Granville, maybe. So, so there's going to be some excited races. I mean, we really are off to the races. I mean, the maps were not dry, and we saw people staking out their claims.
And I'm glad you mentioned Tim Moore, because we're going to shift gears a little bit. Redistricting wasn't the only thing that was on the plate for the General Assembly, and the fact that Tim Moore, who has already said he's not going to run for Speaker again and not going to run for the General Assembly again, he is considering running for Congress, and that means there's going to be a new Speaker in the 2025 session. And Alex, interesting development on that front in just the past day.
So obviously with Moore being gone, and I believe he's the longest serving House Speaker in history, that leaves an opening. And so we had some candidates that were running for Speaker. Destin Hall from Caldwell County. We had John Bell, who's the current Majority Leader for Wayne County, and then Jason Sain from Lincoln County. All these guys were vying for the nomination. I think it really ended up being kind of a two-man race between Bell and Hall, but the race never actually happened. I believe Hall has secured Bell and Sain's endorsement now.
That's been reported in a couple of different places as we're recording now.
That was the big news this week, and so basically we're not going to have this big contentious Speaker race most likely. I know Keith Kidwell, as it stands, is still in the race technically.
Yeah,
but
I think what we need to say is this was a consolidation of sort of support behind one person among the leadership and sort of the maybe establishment Republicans that have been managing the caucus over the last decade. And, you know, the thought was if you divided those people up, you might allow a much more hard-right conservative like Keith Kidwell, who we're all fans of here, but who chairs the Freedom Caucus to become Speaker. And so I think those guys worked it out. There'll still be a Speaker race. You know, it's a year to go. You don't know what's going to happen, but
potentially.
And by the way, you know, we do a lot of good journalism around here. Hat tip to Lucille Sherman with Axios, who first broke this story, and it was a really big piece of news about sort of the consolidation. It sort of answers the question of who are going to be the major fundraisers from here through the end of next year, going into the session, because the Speaker of the House is traditionally the largest fundraiser for that caucus, but Tim was probably going to be running for Congress, worried about his own thing. So it answers some interesting questions that I don't think any of us expected to be answered.
And here's the deal with what they kind of worked out too is Destin Hall, who's the current Rules Chair, is moving up to Speaker. You know, obviously there's going to have to be an election, but from what I heard is that they told the caucus and they stood up in a standing ovation once they announced the deal. And then John Bell, who's the current Majority Leader, longest serving Majority Leader our state's ever had, is moving into the Rules Chair, which is kind of the second most powerful slot in the House. Jason Sain's kind of going to be staying on in his own, doing his own thing, being the Senior Appropriations Chair and the Conference Leader, which
is a big deal. The
It's a
person
huge
who
deal,
writes
yep.
the budget is the big deal.
It's a huge deal. It's a huge deal. So that's a great spot for him to stay in. And then Brendan Jones is going to be likely moving up into the Majority Leader spot, although that's not decided either. That's got to be voted on.
Brendan Jones,
by the caucus.
A representative from Columbus County that also has part of Robinson County. If you don't know, Destin Hall, of course, he led the Republicans' election and redistricting efforts in the State House this year.
Yeah, we saw him earlier.
Yeah.
He was the one chairing that committee. We
Right,
saw
and
the video.
I think what you could expect is that I think the House of Representatives is a difficult body to manage. All sort of lower chambers of legislatures are. And the Republicans have had a really good track record since they took over in 2011, first with Tom Tillis, and then for the last decade with Speaker Moore. And I think the thought there is, and nobody loves everything somebody does in these things, because you have a lot of different decisions, a lot of pieces of legislation, a lot of coalitions to deal with. But I think that, Representative Hall is seen as sort of a continuation of the model that has worked well for Republicans, which is conservative, moderately conservative on a lot of social issues, very conservative on spending and issues, pro-economic development. But I think a continuation of what we've seen over the last decade.
Yeah, very interesting stuff. Just a couple of brief notes on other things happening at the General Assembly. For all intents and purposes, the work for the year is done. There was an adjournment resolution. They may come back the week after Thanksgiving if they had to, or perhaps a couple of days before Christmas if they had to, but they don't want to come back if they don't have to, and they've spelled out a plan to come back once every couple of days each month until the short session starts in April. There was an appointments bill. I want to ask Andy about this because one of the sets of appointments has been challenged by Roy Cooper, and that is a new elections board. 4 members appointed by top Republican legislative leaders, 4 appointed by Democratic leaders. This could be a big change in elections enforcement and regulation.
It could be. Now, we also have to remember that currently, or not currently, more formerly, whoever controlled the governor's mansion controlled elections in North Carolina because they got to appoint the majority of not just the state board, but all 100 county boards as well. And this deals with stuff like certifying elections. This decides like how many early voting sites you're going to have and where they're going to be located. So there's been this claim by Governor Cooper that, well, Republicans are going to use this to essentially shut down early voting. We never saw any evidence of that when Pat McCrory was in charge of appointing all the elections boards. So I don't expect a similar thing to happen now that you have bipartisan boards. What we will expect, though, is that there's going to be more incentive for both sides to compromise on things like locations. Republicans may want to say, well, we'd like to have another location in a more rural part of the county because we don't want to have folks driving 40 minutes, 50 minutes round trip.
Yeah, you may actually see more early voting opportunities. I think you will.
And, so there's going to be a trade-off to it. But you also have to remember, early voting sites are not free. They cost counties money. They also stretch out resources for the county, but also for the parties because they have to try to appoint observers for all of those. So you need to kind of find a Goldilocks zone of what is the right number for these early voting sites, and having a system where you're encouraging compromise will help us get to that Goldilocks zone, I think.
I will predict on the even election boards that democracy will continue to work. Governor Cooper says it won't work. We're not going to certify elections. It's going to be a disaster. I'll take his money on that bet. I bet we continue to have a functioning election system in North Carolina that produces electoral results.
You heard that prediction here first from Dallas Woodhouse. Before we switch gears, David and Alex, anything else about the General Assembly and what it's up to that we should mention before we shift to one of David's other stories?
I don't think so. I mean, you touched on the adjournment resolution. November 29th is the date where they're supposed to return potentially. But other than that, they've taken care of business.
We've seen this over the last few years, Mitch, that the legislature is hesitant to actually adjourn to a date certain. That deals with sort of the complications of calling themselves back into session. And I do know that the Republican attorneys that advise the legislature are expecting, as they always have, numerous lawsuits on the legislative and congressional maps. Mm-hmm. And that is a big reason that we have to have these sort of skeleton sessions where everybody comes, where 5 or 6 members come, stare at each other for a few minutes every few days, once a week, is because they want to be able to come back at a moment's notice if they have to react to some sort of development in redistricting.
Well, I can say that I have hit refresh several times on Pacer account in the Middle District of North Carolina to see if anything's been filed today. As we were recording, nothing yet, but we could see suits anytime. Let's go ahead now and switch back to the issue of school choice. David, in addition to all of this stuff about redistricting and maps and elections, you had an interesting piece this week about school choice. Tell us about it.
Yeah, so there's a new poll out from the Yes Every Kid Foundation. It's a national poll. If we could just put up, yeah, there we go on the screen. So this is the next step in a long line of polls that have just shown widespread support for school choice concepts. And this one was specifically of parents, which I think is important, showing what they would support. So, roughly 2/3 support for, ESAs, education tax credits, all that sort of thing, across demographics, even, Democrats, minorities, support for it. I think we've seen this broadly in polling before.
Some other interesting findings, too, on another slide that we'll have up there shortly. It's talking about some of the support for school choice. There you go.
Right. I think this is interesting, too, because a lot of the argument against school choice is that it would hurt public education in general. And I think these results are interesting because it shows that a lot of parents believe that it would actually improve the environment for education overall by having more options. And kind of related to this, back to our discussion about the General Assembly, where things are going in the future with maps and all that, we're coming out of a year now that was a very significant year for the expansion of school choice in North Carolina. So the question is, what might be the next step with things? I think one interesting thing is, even as the Opportunity Scholarship Program has now been extended to all families in the state, there was a bill introduced in the session that would have basically converted it over time into an education savings account. And that's a step in school choice that several different states are taking now. And it would go a step further than the Opportunity Scholarship in that it would actually give control of the account to parents, and they could use it on a variety of approved expenses. So it would even in a more powerful way, really empower parents to make educational choices for their kids.
Alex, based on what we know about the people who are in charge and likely to be in charge again, school choice still going to be a high priority?
I think so, and even on, so all it would take is the Senate maintaining its Republican supermajority, and the House doesn't even need a supermajority on school choice. There are a number of Democrats, 4 or 5 right now, who are somewhat in support of school choice that they can work with. And so the path to, increasing school choice in North Carolina is not a super difficult one politically right now. And we saw it this year. With Tricia Cotham, she was a Democrat who switched to a Republican, partially over that issue as well as a bunch of other things. But the Republicans in the House didn't have a supermajority, and yet they already had plenty of votes for school choice, despite the governor's objections.
Dallas school choice, political winner?
It has been a political winner, and but I think we saw a huge expansion of school choice here. I would think that the legislature will be somewhat cautious, let this program get out there, be adopted by families over the next few years, see where it goes before we make any dramatic changes. I may be wrong on that, but that's what I would think.
Before we wrap up for the week, we wanted to give you an opportunity. You and your colleague at American Majority, Ned Ryan, recently had a chance to write something for Carolina Journal. What'd you say? We
did. I think it is important, Mitch, that we look at North Carolina's new election laws as conservatives. Republicans have passed significant enhancements to election security. My friend Andy Jackson here has written a lot about this. Those include enhancements and improvements to the same-day registration period during in-person early voting. It includes having a election day deadline for mail ballots to be submitted. And it clarifies some other things when it comes to auditing procedures and poll observers. But I think now as conservatives, we really have to embrace the idea of early voting. The former president scared a lot of people off on this. A lot of voters are concerned when they see things in like Arizona or other places that have, universal ballot harvesting. We don't have those things in North Carolina, but in the long run, the point of our article, and you can find it at carolinajournal.com, is if Republicans and conservatives are going to be competitive in North Carolina, they are going to have to improve their performance in early and mail voting. And we are working on that across the state at American Majority.
I'm going to throw one more thing in here because we had it earlier and it was so good I don't want to let it go, and that is the tweet of the week. Back on redistricting, Alex, you highlighted something about comments that Dan Blue had made about double bunking of candidates.
He basically said Lisa Grafstein was double bunked with Senator Jay Chaudhry, whose name I unfortunately spelled wrong there. And then we had down in the southern part in Mecklenburg, we had...
Just a reminder to the viewers, double bunking means that they were drawn into a district with another incumbent member of the legislature.
Thank you,
and of course, you have to live in your district in a legislative district, unlike Congress.
Thank you. Yep. And then we had Vicky Sawyer was drawn in together with
Natasha Marcus.
Marcus. And so Vicky Sawyer's Iredell, Natasha Marcus is Mecklenburg. And so we had a double bunking of two female senators from opposite parties, and then we had a double bunking of a Democrat woman and a Democratic man in Wake County. And obviously, Dan Blue was kind of accusing Republicans of sexism because his two Democratic members who got double bunked were both female, and so he thought this was a weird coincidence.
And the tweet of the week is the response from Senator Jim Perry up there, who basically is calling this.
Who's basically saying that's ridiculous. 2/3 of the members are women, and by the way, if you're for equality, women have an equal chance to be jammed up by politics in redistricting as anybody else.
And Dallas, you had a tweet. We don't have it, but you said to Senator Blue he could solve this problem himself.
That's right. Dan Blue could have put an amendment up that would have changed that district a little bit, that would have bunked him with Jay Choudhury instead of Lisa, and he didn't do it. So it's a bunch of crying here over spilt milk. Democrats are going to have to figure out how to win elections, and so are Republicans. And we're going to have good competitive elections going forward. But the geography and sort of the political maps in North Carolina are going to favor Republicans for some considerable time.
Well, that's a good note to end it on. That's all the time that we have this week. We hope that you will like the Debrief, subscribe to the show, do all those great things on social media. Follow Carolina Journal on social media accounts. Visit carolinajournal.com for the latest on politics and public policy in North Carolina. And please join us again next week for another edition of the Debrief.